welcome to another Is There More to Life Than Netflix, where a pair of friendly vicars, myself and my friend Andy here, talk about questions about all around the meaning of life and faith and all that kind of stuff, because we love to do it. And we know that ever since the pandemic started and lockdown happened, people have got a lot of questions, and we thought, what easier way for you to ask your questions than sat on your sofa scrolling through your phone, and you can ask us anything you want. So that's what we do massively encourage during this, is for you to send in your questions. And we had some brilliant questions last week, which has spurred what we're going to be talking about today. But before we get to that, let me just introduce ourselves, or let us introduce ourselves. My name is Dave. I am a church leader up in Crosby, North Liverpool. So we run Story House, which is a coffee shop and a church. And both of those have been interrupted in different ways at the moment, and both are trying to find new ways forward. And this is my friend Andy. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, we're friendly this week rather than tame, which is nice. Yeah, my name's Andy. I'm been the associate minister at a church called St Werburgh's in the centre of Derby for the past 2.5, almost 3 years. And then in this last couple of weeks, I've just been licensed to be a church leader at a church in a place called Mackworth, which is on the edge of Derby. And basically, we're taking a bunch of guys from St Werburgh's and we're kind of restarting church on the estate. So in Christian circles, it's often called a church plant, which is like, you kind of plant something, you hope that it's going to grow. And we're actually going to be moving in a week's time as well. So lots going on in our life, and really quite excited about that too.
Awesome, that's really cool. So hopefully we are going to have Andy with us next week, and it all depends on data and finding stuff.
Data and broadband. Yeah.
Yeah, all that kind of thing. Been through that experience. So yeah, as I said before, we had some fantastic questions from a guy called Paul last week. The really good kind of wrestling with what often are the really classic questions for someone who isn't a Christian, which is all to do with suffering. And so this week we're talking about, why did God allow coronavirus? So the world has seen mass deaths, economic shutdowns, which is leading to job losses and all this. And, despite the fact that there are all kinds of silver linings to this dark cloud, it's still a dark cloud. An awful lot of bad stuff has happened. People have lost loved ones. People have lost jobs. It's created all this turmoil. And, no one would say that this was a good thing. No one would have caused it themselves. And so it throws up all these questions. Basically, where is God in this? What is God up to? Is God in control? If he is in control, why would he do this kind of thing? Andy and myself have both run this thing called the Alpha course, where people get to explore Christianity, ask all their questions about it. And the number one question that always comes up time and time again is this one. It's like, why do bad things happen to, people who've done nothing wrong? And why did disasters happen? Why does illness happen? All this kind of thing. And often it is affected by personal experience. And, there is no one, who's reached adulthood without having some kind of trauma, some kind of upset, something that just seemed really unfair happening to them. And, that's something that is true for myself. Sure, it's true for Andy. For myself, we've actually started a blog and a small organization called Saltwater and Honey to help people through childlessness, because that's been our own experience of multiple miscarriage, not being able to have our own children, and finding out that lots of other people were going through that as well, with very little or no support and no understanding of what to do with that. And so my own life has been massively affected, and its course altered by something that just seemed random and unfair and utterly wrong, and without many kind of easy answers for it. And so when we're talking today, we're not just going to be talking abstract. We're not talking, head in the clouds kind of thinking, but like real life experience, stuff that really affects people. And we're really aware of that. And we were chatting before, Andy, this is, sometimes we call this like the difference between the head and the heart stuff, right?
Yeah, totally. And I think, just to reiterate what you said, that everybody watching, yourself and myself, all of us have had stuff. And I think, there's so many things I could pick out. I guess one that stands out very early for me would be that I had a sister who, when she was born, she was a little bit older than me, and she was obviously older than me because she was born before me, but she had a heart defect, and a few years into her life, she had to have an operation for that and didn't get enough oxygen and was brain damaged. And then a few years later had another operation, a similar thing happened, and she died. And so for me, like many others, death was something that was part of life very early on, and it is something that raises those questions. I think it's not just a kind of a head, let's go and look at a bookshelf, but actually all of us are asking these questions from different perspectives, and that comes in.
Yeah, and can I ask you, if it's okay, a question about that in two parts, really?
Go for it.
Which is, with everything that happened there with your sister, like, have you found answers that are easy, would be the first one, and the second part, satisfactory?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one because obviously that particular incident was when I was very young. So the questions you ask as a very young child are different, and the kind of the answers you get. I was brought up at a home which was Christian, and there's always a sense of believing that she went to be with Jesus when she died, and all those kind of things. But I think as you get older and you face death or redundancy or disease or relationship breakup, you ask those questions, and I think the answers are genuinely different. I think in the midst of it, when you're really hurting, the fact that somebody has sat down and done a PhD on why does God allow suffering, actually those answers I don't think are a lot of use. But I think what matters in those moments is God real? Does God care? Does he love me? And are people surrounding me and caring for me in this time? Even perhaps because you go through those kind of grief things, don't you, of kind of numbness and denial and all of that. All those things you go through, I'm no expert on them, but I think you need different things at different moments, and I don't think you ever sew it up that it's completely all sorted in terms of you can go back and still ask why for all sorts of things, but yeah, so I think there are different questions that do go on. I think there are definitely the heart questions, which are you need somebody alongside you and walking with you, and then the head questions get raised often in other situations or further along the line when you kind of can emotionally deal with them, I think.
Yeah, and we talked about it again last week, but there's potentially the oldest book in the Bible, book called Job, tells the story of this man who lost everything. It's interesting that book tries, really ancient book, thousands of years old, tries to do both things. It tries to look at both situations, both the kind of emotional world and what we should and shouldn't do, and then actually the questions that come afterwards, and they do tend to come afterwards. And that's the thing is, if we look at just one side of this, we're not going to deal with the whole thing, because my experience has been, and I've seen it happen with a lot of other people, is once you start to get that distance of time from the event, then you do kind of start asking the questions, and you do go looking for those answers as to what happened there. And so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at both sides of this equation. We're going to look at the emotional thing and what we do with that, and the actual real lived experience of suffering and losing loved ones. And then also those questions that come after it when you've got a bit of distance from the event, how do we make sense of all of this? But we're going to start with the questioning side of things, like how do we make sense of this, of suffering in a world and where there is a God. And as always, we're going to encourage you, if you're watching live, to put your comments and questions below in the comments box, and so we can interact with you. So if you do have a question, do pipe in. It gets way more interesting when you pipe in. Otherwise, we'll just ramble on. And we'll love that, but you'll like it less. So thanks to Paul and Gillian for joining in. Great to have you with you. And yay, we've got Paul just back from work with us this evening. Great to have you with us, mate. Fantastic. So yeah, let's kick it off with the intellectual side of this question of, like, why does suffering happen in a world where there is a God? And to do that, we have to go back a long way to a guy called Epicurus. And Andy, you are way more the obsessive reader than me. So
well, I'm not sure that's true. I think I read things that you recommend to me. And this makes me sound far more intelligent than I am, because I do not go around reading Greek philosophers. But it's not a new
say, we are Goodreads friends, and on Reading Challenge, you're way ahead of me.
Okay, all right. It's been a good year. Well, I mean, in many ways, it's been a bad year, but it's been a good year for reading.
Good year for reading.
That's right. There's only so much Netflix you can watch, which is why we're podcasting, I think.
Well, yeah, there goes that caring, loving thing that we were supposed to be doing today. Like, it's been a great year. Oh wait, sorry. Yeah, anyway, long way around again. Tell us about Epicurus, Andy.
So Epicurus was a Greek philosopher, and he said this. He said, if God is willing to prevent evil, but not able, then he is not omnipotent, which kind of means that he's not all powerful. If he's able but not willing, then he is malevolent, which means he's kind of not very nice. And if he is both able and willing, then whence come evil? We don't say whence very much, but he's basically saying, well, if he's both able and willing to stop it, then why on earth is there evil? And it says if he's neither able nor willing, then why call him God? So he kind of puts this little triangle together and goes, well, these things exist, and you suppose you tell me that God is all powerful, and you suppose you tell me that God is all good, but evil exists. So what the heck?
Yeah. So kind of what gives? And that question has been around for how long?
Thousands of years.
So Andy, get us started. Where's one of the places that we can go to start giving an answer to this kind of thing?
Well, I suppose I'd love to big up another kind of podcast, really, the Speak Life podcast. A guy called Glen Scrivener was exploring this the other day, did a big kind of session on Epicurus. And so if you're really interested in Epicurus and that kind of approach to life, he was very much about that life is about good things. Go to Speak Life, watch them on YouTube. I really like Glen's stuff. Really, really good. But I think one of the things that we need to think about this problem is that there's a kind of there's a smuggled idea in here that if that God couldn't have any reasons that we wouldn't know. God could have any reasons that we wouldn't know about. So we're kind of saying, well, actually, God could have any reasons that we wouldn't know about. Does that make sense?
Yes. So it's basically what you assume in saying that is that you have the same capacity as God.
Yeah, and I guess as Christians we would want to go to places like, there's a book called Isaiah, who's a big prophet in the Bible. If you kind of open your Bible in the middle, if you've got a paper version, you often land on Isaiah, and there's some incredible stuff in there. But one of the bits that gets quoted a lot is, my thoughts are not my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways, says the Lord. And often people that aren't people of faith can say, well, that's just a get out. You're just kind of appealing to mystery. But the thing is, if we really believe that God is who he is and who he says he is, and we believe that he kind of made everything we can see and holds everything in his hand, then God's ability to understand and know things has to be so far beyond. He's not just a bigger version of us. Sometimes we sing kids songs in church, it just sounds like God's a bit bigger than us, really. But actually God is completely other. He's completely different. Yes, we're made in his image, but God is completely outside that. And if we go outside at night and we look up the sky and we see the stars, if you're not in London, it blows your mind. If you go and stand on the edge of the Grand Canyon, if you're fortunate enough to do that, if you go and stand on a beach and look out to the sea, you suddenly feel very small. And actually, I think we have to remember that as Christians, we believe that the God we worship is just infinite, and therefore his understanding of the way the world works is so much larger than us, and he sees a far bigger picture than us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And little plug for Sunday, but at Storyhouse Church on Sunday, which you can watch on YouTube and Facebook, we're going to be looking at Ecclesiastes 3, and part of that, it's this again, another ancient book of like wisdom, trying to find meaning in life, basically. And it goes, you put eternity in the hearts of men. And a lot of people love that, and that's wonderful, isn't it? Great that there's eternity in the hearts of men. But the way it's being said is actually like just how frustrating that is. It's like we've got this drive in us to understand everything, to know everything, to appreciate there's something much bigger than ourselves. We can never reach it. We can never get there. And so actually the writer of that is frustrated, that wants to know more and knows that they're limited as a human being. And that is kind of where, like in the Bible, where wisdom, where proper living begins, is kind of recognizing, yes, we're aware of something much bigger than ourselves, but yes, we are also limited. Like there is a limit to our knowledge and our understanding. It doesn't mean we give up, but it kind of places us in that place. And it's interesting, a lot of Christian authors have rushed out books, small and big, during coronavirus to kind of give answers to this question. Amongst them, John Lennox, Walter Brueggemann, and Tom Wright. And the Tom Wright one summarized, because I've not read it, so I'm not going to claim I've read it and I'm summarizing. This is his summary of it, is that we come to this and we're like, you know what, if I was God, I wouldn't run the world like this. I wouldn't have suffering, I wouldn't have diseases, all that kind of thing. And he kind of says essentially, well, sorry, you don't get to decide how God runs the world. That's not your job. You're not capable of doing that. You know, the pop culture version of that would be like Bruce Almighty, where he's given the controls for a week, and when he is, everything like falls apart as he's trying to make decisions as God. He's not capable. And essentially the way that God chooses to do this is that rather than like pulling the levers from a distance, he comes down into the world and gets his hands dirty in the middle of suffering, which is seen most clearly in the person of Jesus, we believe is uniquely the Son of God come down as a human being, and gets his hand dirty, suffers, experiences suffering, experiences the loss of friends, goes through death himself, all, you know, goes like, right. And that is the way that God actually chooses to deal with this, not the way that we would choose to deal with it. And there is this element of, God is up to things that we can't get our head around there.
Yeah. And I mean, every week I think Glen Scrivener talks about Jesus smuggling. You know, we smuggle Jesus in because you know, he is the center of our faith, and he is what it's all about. And I think if we take him out of the picture, actually we're left with something that's not Christian, firstly, but it is one of the kind of responses the Bible gives. And I think we touched on this a bit last week, but actually whether you're Christian or not, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Hindu or atheist or agnostic or kind of whatever you are, everybody has to have some kind of answer to this problem of suffering. Although it's presented to Christians and vicars, and when people come on Alpha, as you say, it's the question that always comes up. Actually, whatever you believe about the world, you have to have some kind of answer to this question. And I think last week we said, well, often the answer for many atheists is, well, just have to shrug your shoulders and go, well, that's what life is like. You just got to deal with it, mate. Really sorry, but that's what it is. And and that might be true, but it doesn't emotionally help very much. And I know that just because emotionally the Christian answer response may be better, doesn't make it true either. You know, but actually there is something in there that I think if something's true, it has to help you to live well. And I think that's very important. So I think the person of Jesus is obviously central, but the Bible has a number of responses. I think we have to be careful. It doesn't. I don't think you or I would say it has answers to this problem, but I think it does have responses. And actually, our favourite author, who we might have quoted every week for the last X number of weeks, would say actually the biblical answers are numerous. Like there are a lot of responses that the Bible gives to the problem of suffering. And I guess we could talk through what some of those responses. I mean, we've mentioned kind of that lament. We've mentioned Jesus, but there are some others we might want to touch on as well.
Yeah, definitely. Before we get to those, let's jump off a comment from Paul, who brings up something that's kind of has appeared in different guises online and things since this started. So, would it be awful to say the world allowed the coronavirus as the world was being torn apart by the human race?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I think philosophers would want to do is separate natural evil from kind of human evil. So there are natural disasters that seem to happen, and we could talk about the fact the world is fallen. And there's also those human evils, and often I think with natural disasters there's a mixture of both. So one of the times I remember this question getting asked a lot was that horrendous Boxing Day tsunami. You know, it was awful, and you know the death toll was huge. I can't remember how many years ago. It shows my age, but it was quite a few years ago now. And lots of people went, "Oh my goodness, how could God allow this?" And I think that question was a question worth asking. But this is the natural element of the natural disaster. But there was also the fact that the people that suffered the most were the poorest, the people that didn't have early warning systems, the people who, kind of lived, kind of very close together, the people that lived right on the water's edge, the people that didn't have good communication. You know, they were the ones that suffered the most, and the ones who had better technology, better finances, better communication suffered less. And I think that's often the way that people who obviously are less better off in terms of finances and economies and things often always suffer the most. And so there is a human element to the natural suffering that goes on. And I think the coronavirus, we're just beginning to see that now. It's kind of gone through the West, hasn't it? Through the East, and then come through Europe and to the States. And it's kind of big, South America. And I haven't heard much about Africa, but I think if it really takes hold in kind of Africa in a major way, it will be just absolutely horrendous, because people are living very often very close together. In many places, hygiene is far worse. People don't have the kind of the hospital resources. There's not the healthcare available. People can't just isolate. People don't have the finances. If you don't work, you don't eat. There's all kinds of things that are going to make it far, far worse. And those are human elements amidst the kind of the natural evil suffering that goes on as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's this combo of things. The other thing I'd say that's really interesting about your question, Paul, is like I've chatted to a lot of people who aren't Christians who kind of talk in a similar kind of way, who kind of attribute certain actions and things that have happened to either the world or to the universe, which is kind of the first step towards at least the kind of some kind of acceptance that there's a God, because that implies intelligence, it implies thinking, it implies even morality, this kind of idea. So there's a regular in a cafe that we have long chats about, and I can say this comfortably because she knows we don't agree. That she believes the universe gives her things and orders her and directs her, and I'd say that's an interesting kind of first step to saying, basically calling that thing God, because if that thing can make decisions, has that amount of power, can order things, it's not the full description of God as we know it, but it's kind of the first step towards it. So if we are talking about some kind of God, then the question is, one potential answer to the Epicurean question is, God caused it. This was his choice. He was, balancing the population or sending judgment, as Matthew Firth put. It's perfectly possible that coronavirus was sent by God as a form of judgment. He's done it before. The Bible makes that clear. So one thing about that is true. There are certainly stories throughout the Bible where plagues have been sent by God in order to, for example, if you've watched Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, is one of the ways by which God helped get his people out of Egypt. Later on, plagues amongst his people when they drifted away from him and started outright rebelling against him, all that kind of thing. I've talked about this quite a lot on Sunday, so I'm going to answer this kind of directly. And so me and Matthew might disagree on this one. But so for me, I think that Jesus' teaching makes us shy away from making neat one-to-one correlations on this. So the Tower of Siloam being an example of it. So people come to Jesus with this report of fellow Galileans that have been killed in Jerusalem by Pilate, the guy who ran Jerusalem as a Roman. And they're all up in arms about this. And then Jesus points to this other event where a tower fell, killed 18 people. And he basically, the subtext to all that is, this could happen to any one of you. So those people were no different to you. And there's another occasion where there's a man who was born blind, and his disciples were like, was this his fault or his parents' fault? His sin or his parents' sin, as they put it. And he's like, neither. So, as Jesus kind of reveals things, I think it should make us extremely wary of making one-to-one kind of correlations, while at the same time recognizing that these kind of disasters and suffering do not seem to be the way that God wanted the world to be. That also seems to be part of the story. Don't know if you want to jump in on that, Andy.
Yeah, so I think that would be another response that the scriptures would talk about, that actually, God created the world good, and then humanity fell away from God. We talk about this kind of big story of creation, and then the fall, so the kind of Adam and Eve story where humanity, they sin, they walk away from God, and sin enters the world. And so there's definitely a connection between our sin and suffering. But I think, as you say, that direct linking of a specific sin to specific suffering is, I think we just got to be really hesitant. I mean, I think there's cause and effect sometimes. So I think, if I go out and get absolutely smashed in the pubs, which are not open, but let's say Saturday night, pubs open, go down into Derby, get absolutely hammered, and then jump into my car, and then, on the way back, knock down 3 people, then actually there's an obvious, cause and effect there. I shouldn't have got absolutely hammered and jumped into my car and driven. So I think those are places where things are obviously linked. But I think, as you say, things like, why was this person born blind? Well, actually, he's born blind, but he could be healed for the glory of God. That story. So, I think the challenge, there is definitely a real challenge in that. And I know on a number of the Facebook groups, Christian Facebook groups I'm part of, there was a lot of toing and froing and discussing this very question, actually. How do these two things link up? And some people were like, these things are clearly linked, and other people were like, I want to be more hesitant about that. So I think there's a lot of good questions about it, but I would be personally very hesitant to draw strict links between an individual or a nation and those things.
Definitely. And to be fair to Matthew, as he says, that's why he said possible and not definitely. Definitely, that's true. But it is interesting because I'd say, if you've got a one extreme, those Christians who jump on this and say this is because you've done X, Y, and Z, this is God calling judgment down on you. You've got Christians, I'd say, at the other extreme who are kind of saying, well, God would never do anything like this. And, basically God is the kind of like that really friendly uncle who just showers you with gifts and, never says anything to you or all that kind of thing, which leads to one of the potential, if not reasons for suffering, at least redemptions for suffering, which is that it's character forming. And there are several passages in the New Testament I can think of that connect the suffering that Christians were going through as making them more like Jesus, which in Christian theology is basically making them more human, making them the best type of person they could be. And they saw it as themselves sharing in the same sufferings that Jesus went through in order to, essentially walk the same path that Jesus did, become like Jesus, walk that path of death and resurrection, essentially. And I think, like, just on a natural level, we all know, like, a spoiled child we call it a spoiled child for a reason, because they've been given everything they want. And their character is all over the shop. They can't cope with adversity. They're selfish, they're loud, they're annoying, they're no good to anyone else around them. Whereas a child who's been brought up with a good level of kind of discipline, including having to struggle occasionally on their own, having been corrected when they got things wrong, tend to grow up into adults who can cope with life better. And one of the things the Bible seems to say is that when we go through suffering, when we go through hard times, it actually forms better character. And and so this is why you tend to see this kind of cycle happens in culture where, for example, those who went through the war, they threw nothing out. They knew how to mend things. They were incredibly frugal. And so the economy boomed after the war because these people had great discipline around money and things. And then their children didn't need it. And so they, that kind of birthed modern consumerism and, a lot of the mess that we're in today. But then, that will cause the world to take a dip. And so the next generation then becomes, really disciplined and frugal, and so on and so forth. So that's just on a natural level. And then the Bible, again, quite clearly says that, he allows some suffering and hardships so that we can be formed into better people. So I don't know, do you want to jump in on that one, Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I think of some of the people that I most look up to and most respect, they're people who've been formed by suffering. Did they want that? No, they didn't. If I think particularly of Christians as well, and I don't think it's limited to Christians, but I think of Christians who've suffered. Actually, often their faith is stronger. I often think that actually suffering either pushes people towards God or it pushes them away from Him. And I mean, that's a difficult question. Why some people do they wander away and some people don't? But those people who do stick the course and do continue to follow Jesus in the midst of it, often, as you say, I think they're more like Jesus than anyone I know. They're less selfish, they're more patient, they're more gracious, they're more generous because they've been formed. Their priorities, I think, are being rearranged in the midst of the suffering, and they recognise what really matters. Now, I think the challenge with the kind of character building is, what about when this suffering is extreme? And I know often they say if ever you go to something like a Holocaust on the internet, then you've lost the argument, because you go to the extreme. But even in those situations, you have stories of people like Corrie Ten Boom, who in the midst of in the midst of the concentration camp, was seeing God work and do stuff. And if you look at the kind of somebody like Viktor Frankl, he talks about in the concentration camps, that actually they saw people's character really came out. Saw people who claimed to be Christians, but in the midst of it, their selfishness and those things really came out. But he saw other people that seemed to be living for a different world, and they expressed something totally. They shared what limited bits, scraps of bread they had. They kind of looked after one another, and so even in the most extreme suffering that humanity has brought on one another, I think there still can be a character building. And I recognise that's easy for me to say, sitting here at a nice house in the West in 2020, and those things. But there does seem to be something in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's been my own experience as well. It's like the most difficult things I've been through, thinking, the recurrent miscarriages, the childlessness has formed a lot of who I am as a person. I've learned an enormous amount through it. I've been changed an enormous amount through it, for the better, I would say. Yeah, I would always, given the option to go through it again, it'd be like, no, no. For all the benefit that I came to and all the good that came from it, is like, yeah, I would never choose that to happen. Certainly wouldn't want it to happen to anyone else. So it doesn't go, all the way to answering this question, but it is probably where I'd put it in the category of it's a redeeming feature of it, at least. Like, going through this, it's something good that can come from it. So it's the roses in the manure type thing. It's the good thing that could happen only because of the bad thing type thing. But maybe there's a little bit more than that, because of, I just think the frequency, especially so the New Testament letters. So the Bible split in two halves: Old Testament, New Testament, basically pre-Jesus, post-Jesus. And in the New Testament, you've got the Gospels and Acts, which is the history of Jesus and the early church. And then you've got a whole bunch of letters, which were basically one half of a communication from church leaders who set these churches up, who were writing letters to them when they were physically separated. And, when you read the other half of that letter, the kind of situations they're responding to, it's obvious that these people are, losing jobs, being imprisoned, sometimes even losing their life because they've become Christians, losing their family in a shame culture. They would be shunned when they, rejected their parents' religion, all that kind of thing is happening. So they're suffering a lot. But it goes on to say incredible things like, we glory in our suffering, like even in the most difficult things, because this is building character and perseverance and hope in us. It's actually making us into people who are ready, again, Christian language, but for eternity, who are becoming the kind of people who are suited for heaven. So I think it, immediately correcting myself, there might be something more than just redemption going on there. There might be something that, God is at work. Again, it's a Christian word, redeeming the world, redeeming the whole of creation, basically taking the whole world back to where it's supposed to be and for a better and brighter future. And that includes us. And that isn't going to be through a magic click of the fingers, but it seems to be over this longer process.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, I listened to this podcast the other day on Epicurus, and one of the things that spoke about a lot was that this isn't just limited to Christians. Actually, if you think of so many of our Hollywood films, if you think of so many books that are written, it is the journey of the hero kind of combating evil or suffering and coming out the other side. And we're drawn to those stories. We love those stories. They resonate with us. We put them on the big screen. Classics would be things like Lord of the Rings, kind of going on this journey and all the kind of difficulty they encounter. And actually at the end, there's something incredible. And I think somebody like Tolkien would want to say one of the reasons he loved literature was because it revealed something true about, they kind of pointed to the truest story, which is the story of Jesus. Even if they weren't, even if they were fiction, that actually there was a deeper reality that they were pointing to. And so I think this kind of hero's journey, resonates with us. We love it, Christian or not, whether the person is a Christian or not. There's something about that really speaks to us, and even on a kind of a very low level, people love on X Factor a story of somebody suffering coming to the live shows. There's something deep in us that loves that.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on this if that's all right, Andy, because I'm obsessed with story theory, and
indeed.
It connects really well with a point that Paul's made, which is, so do you think people will act differently after COVID? So I was watching an interview with someone whose job it is to assess screenplays for Hollywood. So basically, like all the films that are made in Hollywood, they're about 100 or thousands of times more screenplays that are written to be turned into films that never are. And it's the job of some people to basically filter through these scripts and see which ones are worth becoming films and which ones aren't. And what she was saying was that she went as far as 99% of scripts get this wrong. In that she said there are a series of events and not a story. And the reason there are a series of events and not a story is because the main character doesn't undergo a change. And this is the heart of story. So we live our lives through the protagonist, through the hero, who journeys through this. And that protagonist, that hero, must undergo an internal change. They must have a flaw in their character, which is confronted and is changed. That is the hero's journey. And there are other people in the story who aren't changed, and they are victims or they are villains. So your victims are kind of like your human props in the story. They'll get mowed down, they'll disappear out. We're not interested in them. The villains, likewise, tend to be unchanging because, they are fixed towards essentially an evil path. But your hero, essentially us in the story, and what we're trying to get from it is trying to work through our flaws and become different people. And part of what's interesting about that is we recognize there are people in the world who aren't changing. Either passively they're victims who are getting squashed by life, or they are fixated on an evil path. They're unchanging in this kind of active kind of evil focus. But actually we recognize in story, which is essentially human psychology, that we need to undergo change, but we often don't. And that's actually one of the reasons we chose at the Storyhouse Church. We're doing a little series over 4 Sundays and looking at it in the week all about change, because the appetite for change is huge right now. So the YouGov survey at the start of lockdown found that 91% of people didn't want life to go back. There's been another survey done recently which is asking questions about the economy and the environment and all those kind of things, and that appetite for change has actually increased. People even more don't want things to go back. So there's a lot of appetite for it, but we hate change because change requires ending things that we're attached to and that we love. It means admitting we've done things wrong our whole lives, and so it's all kinds of kind of painful emotional processes that we go through. That means we don't. And what's more, we need an injection of urgency to change. So right now, the world is working towards us changing, whereas previously it wasn't. Previously in the West, we had just so much ridiculous comfort and ease that we were never going to change because there was no urgency, there's no impetus to change. But when the environment's difficult, when the world we live in is difficult, that's the kind of environment that does invite us to change. But again, it's not inevitable. It's only if we kind of cooperate with it, and only crucially if we have a guide who is outside the situation, who can point us in the way to go, which again is where we come back to the whole God thing and the whole Bible thing. Is like we need a guide for what kind of changes we need to make, what's actually going to make us better and what's going to make the world better.
Yeah. No, I think I love your stuff on story, Dave. And I mean, was that some of the reason that you called yourself Storyhouse?
Yeah, definitely. It was just obsessing over this whole story theory thing, and actually, like, one of the things we kind of came up with was that's really interesting. Is like story is how our brains work. So like we don't dream in formulas or bullet points or graphs. We dream in story. It's the most fundamental way of thinking that we have. And so it taps into something about who we are. And, so much of the Bible is written as narrative. And when you look, and, recently a lot of people have pointed out that, the Bible is written over 1,000 years, many, many authors, but there is a story from beginning to end that's very easy to see through, and you can summarize it in different ways, but there is a story happening there. Which is, again, if it's true, that is something from something that's true.
No, and I think in terms of another response really around this issue of suffering, I think we've named quite a lot of them, but this idea of story, actually, many people would say you can sum it in different ways, but actually it goes from creation to new creation. So the if you've never read the Bible before, but one way of summarizing it would be you start with creation, and then humanity fall away from God, and then you've got this big section about the people of Israel, where God calls himself a people to to live for him, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, and he sends prophets to speak to them and all that sort of stuff, and there's exile and they come back and those sorts of things. And then finally you get God entering history in the person of Jesus, to allow us to come back to him, to create a way for us to have a relationship with him. He lives a perfect life to show us how to live, and then he dies our death on the cross that we deserved, and then he's resurrected to life 3 days later and ascends into heaven. And then the next section would be where he sends the church to go and speak his words, to do his works, and to perform his wonders in the world, where Christians, the church, should kind of do the stuff that Jesus did, really. But then one day, and I think this is another part of the response around suffering, is we don't just think this is going to go on forever, but we think that one day God is going to pull it all together, and he's going to say enough, and he's going to make all things new. I actually believe that there'll be resurrection from the dead. We believe that there'll be judgment, that actually, in these days we've thought a lot about justice. There's been a lot in the news about that, and I believe that's because God is a just God, and we're made in his image, and therefore we desire justice. Martin Luther King spoke about the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice. Well, if you're not a Christian, if you don't believe in God, then why would you believe that? Martin Luther King could say that because he believed in a God who is just. And so actually, I think one of these responses for us in terms of suffering and things is that this isn't the end of the story, that one day God will make all things new. There'll be a new heavens, a new earth, or renewed heavens or renewed earth, however you understand that. And in the words of Lord of the Rings, I know we've said it already, but God will make everything sad come untrue. Those great words of Samwise Gamgee, God will make everything sad come untrue. And it's not just a fairy tale, but actually that story of Lord of the Rings points us towards the true story that our hearts are longing for, that things will be put right and that everything will be kind of made just. And I know that skeptics will say, guys, this is just pie in the sky when you die. This is just kind of opiate for the people. It's that kind of stuff. But actually we want to say, no, there's something in us that beats for this. And we've seen that desire for justice in these days, and actually I believe that one day that's where the story's going. That is the end of this incredible story.
A few weeks ago I read a brilliant little short story by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce. It's a bus journey from hell into heaven, and there's a bit of it that just blew me away, and I'm still kind of getting my head around it. But this conversation's going on between someone, I think it's like an angel, and one of the guys who's come up from hell type thing, talking about this very thing, about the whole world being made new, and essentially saying that for those who end up in heaven, who end up in the new creation where everything's right, even the greatest tragedy that happened in the past is absorbed into heaven, which is a bit of what we were talking about before, is like we are formed as people by the difficult things. And when it comes into that greater story, when it's not just our story, then that suffering becomes part of the future heaven, just as very much like at the center of this story is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So you've got, a brutal execution as an inseparable part of this story of the world being made new. So the difficult things that happen to us do. And they're saying even the greatest pleasures for those who ended up in hell, who aren't part of the new creation, were simply a foretaste of hell. They lost their pleasure. They became kind of ashes in the mouth type thing, because of the trajectory, because of where it's going, it affects, even backwards. And I'm still getting my head around that, but there's something really profound in there that really rings true, in that our lives are determined by the end. Like stories are determined by the ending. And all the moral lessons kind of fall in line when you reach whatever the end is, and you can turn a story upside down by twisting the ending, which is what a lot of horror is based on, by flipping the ending and all that kind of thing. And if the world is headed towards this new creation, then even the difficult stuff is caught up in that, which kind of brings us to the last thing which I'd like us to talk about, which is the whole heart stuff that we mentioned at the start. Which is, when you're actually walking through this stuff, when you're actually dealing with people who are dying, and when you're dealing with these difficult realities, when you've got a loved one who has died, it's a very different set of questions and activities and things that you have to reach out for. And one of the things we discovered at Saltwater and Honey, so Saltwater and Honey is this little organization we started with some friends who've been through childlessness and child loss themselves. And we found that our contemporary Western culture, has zero answer for suffering. doesn't know what to do with it whatsoever. And the reason you know that is because no one talks about it publicly. No one knows what to do with it. It's just an interruption, basically. You just have to get over it and move on. And even the people who are working hard in secular contexts to deal with suffering just cannot come up with any kind of meaningful answer for what to do with it. There are no resources out there. And again, our favorite Tim Keller, when I heard him preach on this, and he was saying, you know, contemporary culture doesn't know what to do with it. It rang so true from our experiences that people don't have resources to deal with this. And now, you know, as we've been talking, what comes with Christianity is not one answer, but multiple answers. And we haven't even talked about them all tonight. But alongside with that comes a richness of language and practices that go along with it. So, you know, Jesus himself was able to call upon, for example, the Psalms, which is this kind of book of prayers and poems and songs in the middle of the Bible. And I think it's either 2/3 or 3/4 of them contain some element of lament, which is a language that we have lost entirely in the West. We do not do it anymore. And there's all kinds of theories for that. I might mention them, but basically, but within the Psalms, you know, most of them contain some kind of element of, this is not okay, God. You know, this isn't, why are you doing this? You're supposed, like, it actually brings these questions to light. So you're supposed to be good, but this doesn't look good. You know, you're embarrassing yourself on the public stage here. You know, these kind of things come out, and even like anger directed towards God, all legitimate and okay, and are expressed regularly in these prayers. And, you know, the Bible is, throughout it, doesn't hide from the fact that life comes with a lot of suffering. You know, it doesn't expect anything else, doesn't expect us to expect anything else. And, you know, even those who came after Jesus, as we've talked about already, there's plenty of descriptions of their suffering as well. In the New Testament, as transformed as it was still suffering. But there's these resources then to ask these questions and express it. And so, you know, there's something even very, very practical there for, you know, as Andy was saying, if you open up into the middle of the Bible, you'll hit Isaiah or Psalms. You know, these things flick for long enough, and you will find one that will express pain for a difficulty that's gone through. And that's something that I actually had to build back into my own practice as a Christian, because I think because the church is situated in a surrounding culture, and our surrounding culture is the West, we sometimes unwittingly go along with these trends. And so you look at, you know, worship songs, so songs we sing in church that were written recently, there are very, very few that have this lament aspect in them, that complains about how difficult things are, when, again, 2/3 to 3/4 of the songs in the Bible do have that in there. So you know, we kind of, as the church, even Christians, lost this language. But to go to why it happened in our culture, there's lots of theories, but one of them I find is really fascinating is that Queen Victoria wore black most of her life, and she's famous for wearing black because her husband died, and she chose to publicly own the fact that she was mourning. And then we had 2 world wars, and the theory goes that there was so much suffering, so much loss, and so much to do that essentially we couldn't deal with the amount of pain, because we were dealing with industrialized warfare for the first time, like just death like the world had never seen before. And so essentially we shut down the bit that dealt with mourning and suffering, because we just couldn't deal with that scale of suffering, and we had a lot of work to get on with. So it just became the whole classic keep calm and carry on. He shut down the emotions, get on with things. And something that made me laugh was listening to a church leader I think is great, Pete Scazzero. He started a church in New York, which is multinational, multiracial, back in the 70s, and it's still going strong today. And he was talking about the way that he has difficulty in his church with different cultures, because they all are so different. And so a lot of frictions and tensions will come up in his church because people come from all around the world. And he was talking about some of these differences, and then he said, you know, at one end You've got like a Latino funeral where everyone will be wailing and jumping into the grave even and stuff. And he says at the other end, you've got a British funeral where someone might not even turn up. And I was like, oh my goodness. He's had experience of people from all around the world. He says like the worst at mourning. Oh, the British. I'm like, oh, fantastic. But it would chime in with that idea of like, yeah, we just cannot deal with suffering. Has that been your experience in the church as well, Andy? Does that ring true for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting thinking around the funeral thing. I mean, just going down that route, you know, we've even often now in desperation, I think, or maybe not desperation, maybe that's too harsh a word, but we want to even turn funerals into celebrations of life, don't we? Actually, they're, you know, we've almost sometimes want to even remove the mourning element from them because we don't want to dwell on that. And it's right that we celebrate life. I'm not saying that, but you know, whereas before there was a kind of almost like a uniform, you know, kind of black suits and black ties, that has begun to go in some cases, and people are actually often encouraged not to do that. And I think there is definitely something there about not knowing what we do. We don't have any cultural agreed cultural way of doing that. And I think, and in terms of the church, I think one of our kind of spiritual heroes, Pete Gregg, would say that the Bible is often more honest about unanswered prayer and suffering than the church is. And I think I suppose I would want to encourage people, like you say, to be honest with God in prayer. You know, read those bits of the Bible that resonate with that. I mean, I think one of the things we have to remember is that most of church history, people have existed without anesthetics and antiseptics and antibiotics. You know, actually, most of the people that have gone before us who followed Jesus didn't have Advil or you know, whatever it is in the cupboard. I have Advil in the cupboard because I take it from the States, which, you know, bring it back because it's good stuff. But actually, didn't have that. You know, if you got ill, often you would die. The suffering was much more in their faces. And you know, much of the church today around the world, you know, the persecuted church or places where they don't have such good healthcare, actually this stuff is in their face far more. And I think that many of them are far better at dealing with it because it's part of life. Whereas for us, we have got hospitals which we put over there when people are ill. We have crematoriums which are over there. They're not in the, you know, I've managed to get to 39 years old and not see anybody die in front of my face. Whereas in many parts of the world, that would be unbelievable. You know, that would just be what happens as you grow up. So I think we don't have many of the resources, to do that culturally. And I think the Bible does. And I think we need to learn to read it with our brothers and sisters throughout history and our sisters and brothers throughout the world. You know, actually they will pick on other bits of the Bible that often we ignore.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said, you know, the remarkable thing about getting to 39 without anyone dying around you. I think, you know, I've been reminded a few times, listening to different things and reading different things, that historically speaking, the fact that you got to 39 is remarkable. Like that. Yeah. Historically is like, that's an old man. Historically, that's like incredibly fortuitous to get as old as 39. Someone called Rachel Bonds chimed in. You might know her.
I've heard of her, yeah.
Do you think it's our need for comfort in the West that stops us knowing what to do when those around us are suffering? Talking my language, Rach. Yes, that's definitely a massive part of it. There's a book around this that's not a Christian book, but is really helpful to deal with this. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl was a Jewish psychiatrist who survived the concentration camps, but none of his family did. So he went through incredible suffering. And basically, he was around the time when modern psychology was being formed. And basically, Freud was saying that human beings exist for pleasure. That's their ultimate aim. Once they've got everything else and they've got themselves safe, then they'll splurge on pleasure. They'll go for it, and in every kind of way, hedonism, basically. And Viktor Frankl said, no, like we are actually wired for meaning. That's what human beings need, but we will settle for pleasure when we don't have meaning. And I think he was right. And I think that's what's happened in the West, is actually that we, as the meaning leaked out of us. So basically, this is a whole other thing, but, you know, we've made life all about ourselves and our own preferences. And without a grand narrative, without a big story connecting us to other people, then all the meaning kind of trickles out of life. And when you've got no meaning left, then all you do have left to live for is pleasure, which is why your Instagram feed prior to lockdown was just nights out and what you're eating and what you're watching, you know, all that, just basically pleasurable experience after pleasurable experience, you know, because that's all that's left in life. But when you actually live in a difficult environment, and when you have a big story, a grand narrative that connects you to the others, then in that case, then there can be meaning even in suffering. And what Viktor Frankl recognized was that the people who survived the concentration camps, you know, of those who had the choice, of course, the ones who did were the ones who could find meaning amongst what was happening, who could find some kind of redemption. So, you know, even if it was simple as my suffering in this concentration camp will show the world just how evil the Nazi ideology is, you know, that was finding meaning even in the midst of suffering. And again, to bring it back to the biblical story, when you plug into that narrative, into that big story, and you find there can be purpose even in suffering, it's not an interruption. Whereas if you just live for pleasure, if you don't have any meaning of life, then suffering is just an interruption, and the only answer you've got to it is to go back to more comfort. And we've got Denise talking about this. If there's no faith, then there is a void. Pleasure is the easy way to fill it. To do something worthwhile that has meaning is the harder option. Yeah, and it's true. And again, that connects to that earlier thing of, like, often that's why people don't change, is because the meaningful option is often the harder option. And we get back to the hero's journey again. You know, it's never the easy path, it's always the difficult thing. Classic Frodo line, I wish these times had never come to me. You know, it's kind of like no one does who this happens to, but it's what you do with the time that's given to you. And, you know, the time that has been given to us is a time of coronavirus. And one of the kind of calls during this time that I've really appreciated people putting out, and they were putting out early days, is, you know, when you're 90 and you're looking back on this and telling stories to the next generation who are asking, you know, what did you do during the coronavirus pandemic? You know, are you going to say, you know, I did this or that great meaningful thing? Or are you going to say I ate a lot of Doritos and you binge watch TV series?
A bit of both, maybe.
Both, yeah. It's either or for me, I think. I tried to do meaningful work, and I've watched most of The American Office. So, you know.
But both and, yeah.
Andy, we've just got a couple of minutes left. So have you got any final thoughts on this question of why did God allow coronavirus?
I think I'd want to take us full circle back to the person of Jesus. I think without a God that in the person of Christ came and suffered on the cross in our place, you know, allowing us to have a relationship with him, all these other responses don't hold as much water. But I think if we have a God who did that, that speaks so powerfully. And I guess, you know, as always, we would want to encourage people to explore the story of this God, which we've been talking about this evening. I think, you know, because we do believe that this big story does provide purpose, it does provide meaning, it does provide the opportunity to forgiveness and all of those things. It doesn't make life easy. Christians do not have a get out of jail free card. But I think that's, you know, one of the reasons we're doing this is that actually this thing really works even in 2020.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I'd say a very similar thing of, you know, Christians can sometimes get this stereotype of being happy clappy, but they suffer the same as everyone else. But I think the difference is that we do have the resources to redeem that time, for it to be a meaningful suffering, and to actually have hope and bring hope to the world. And you know, I'd say same as Andy, look at what Jesus has to say. On the practical one on that front, you can download an app called The Chosen. You can watch some of the story of Jesus totally for free. It's really well put together. If you're not a reader, if you are a reader, just download the Bible app for free. You can read through the Gospels, first-hand eyewitness accounts of what Jesus did and what he said, and see what he spoke about. Or, you know, if you're going through this difficult time, open up the middle of the Bible, go to a psalm, have a read of it, let those words become your words and express the difficulty that you're going through. But again, just thank you so much for joining in. We're getting a little bit more people joining in every week. It's really fantastic. So thank you so much for joining in the conversation. It means a lot to us. It's great to have you with us. If you found this helpful, we don't normally ask you to do this, but if you did find it helpful, do hit like or share, so that other people can find it. Basically, that's the way these things work on YouTube and Facebook. If people like and share, then other people discover it. So if you think this is worth sharing, please do. If you think it's good, then like it. Story House as a church will be back at 11 o'clock on Sunday, and we're going to be looking at that thing of how we do change in a time like this. And Andy, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can follow at SDF Mackworth. Drop us a DM, so send us a message. A few people have done it in the last few weeks, so do feel free to do that. We'd love to connect with you.
Okay, brilliant. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back again this time next week.